Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a moment, and I'm happy to have you all here with me today. As most of you know, the reason for today's video is the announcement of the winner of the Hear My Story April edition, which, yes, you heard that right, there will now be a May edition as well. I'm going to try to keep this contest going for as long as I can keep up with it. So, I do want to talk a little bit about our winner, and I'm not going to tell you who it is just yet. I want to go over what I use to judge these stories. These stories aren't judged by editing or perfect grammar or even proper story structure. These stories are purely based on my subjective opinion and how I feel about a particular story. That being said, we had a lot of tremendous entries in this month's contest, and I'm not lying when I say the choice was a very, very hard one. I was sorely tempted to make multiple videos, but that really wouldn't be in the spirit of the contest. So unfortunately, there will only be one story made for this contest this month. So without further ado, I present to you this month's winner. Buzz by D.R. Brazzi. It was 2 or 3 years before we started to notice the real impact of the heavy air. By this time our bodies had adjusted, and we barely noticed the difference. The weather had stabilized, and the formerly temperate Middle South had started to become a tropical rainforest. We knew that the insects around us were getting larger, but we all just saw it as a novel curiosity. The first year there were pill bugs the size of a man's foot. The second, our summer growing season was threatened by caterpillars who were roughly the dimensions of a cat. We should have seen the pattern and taken it more seriously, but even in these times, people have a normalcy bias, and we assumed that they had to stop growing eventually. It was during a hunting expedition in the 3rd year after the bombs fell that we discovered the true horror of our new environment. I was walking with a young man named Freddie. We split off from the rest of the group to follow some wild hog tracks. They led us to a swamp where we began to see these alien mud mounds. Stopping to examine the strange, seemingly sculpted domes, Freddie turned to me and asked, "What the hell are they, Mr. Bentley?" "It sort of looks like... It can't be." I used the butt of my rifle to smash open the 3-foot-tall structure and then cleared the dried mud from the top with my knife. Something inside thrashed at the sudden intrusion, and then the nightmare nymph stuck its face through the opening and buzzed angrily. I drove my blade through its eye, then waited for it to stop thrashing before breaking the corpse free of the mud and wrapping it in a tarp. When we got it back to camp, I showed my find to the other men. "So what is it?" Big Jim Tomlin asked. "It's a baby mosquito," I said. "I used to see eggs like those all over stream beds, but those were tiny. These ones..." "Jeez," Big Jim grunted. "If that's the baby, what's the mama look like?" There were 7 of us in all. Every man was expected to hunt game during the day, except for Jim. He was an ex-Marine and his job was to guard the site while the rest of us foraged. The others had their own camp duties. Since this was probably our 20th expedition into the woods, we all knew our part. I cooked. Tonight it was skewered porcupine. It had an unpleasant taste, but I tried to offset it by rubbing it down with salt and wild chives. Freddie stoked the fires and helped Patterson with the skinning and hanging of hides and meat. We saved all of the good finds for the people back home. This time it was 2 pigs and a young buck. Professor Mulberry was busily pressing medicinal herbs between the pages of a pair of heavy books he kept for the purpose. Usually he would ramble endlessly at anyone who was near about the many uses of thistle or the nutritional value of dandelions, but he'd been uncharacteristically silent since I brought back the nymph. He kept staring at the tarp at the edge of the clearing, as if he expected it to start moving. The last 2 were even younger than Freddie. Mason and Walker were tasked with boiling our drinking water and washing our tools and cookware. Beyond that, they chatted and bickered as teenage boys tend to do. We bedded down early. I shared my tent with Patterson. His clothes were caked in dried animal blood, and they gave off a metallic odor. I think that's what attracted them. It was about 1 a.m. when the buzzing started. First it was a distant hum, then it got closer, the sound passing in and out of the clearing. Pretty soon, it became constant. Something landed on the roof of the tent. The fabric sagged under the weight. I reached over and shook Patterson awake. He looked at me with confusion, and I pointed at the dark shape above us. We both stared in silence, trying to figure out what we were looking at. Without warning, a black blade stabbed downward at us. It stuck 1.5 feet into the tent and began shifting back and forth, searching for something. Patterson and I both set up on either side to get a better look at the thing. "It's one of those skeeters you found, isn't it?" Before I could answer, I heard Freddy screaming from the tent next to ours. His shotgun barked out several times. One of the shots tore through the air into Patterson, who fell over with a large hole where his left lung used to be. He laid on the floor dying and made horrible wet gasping noises as he choked on his own blood. I immediately dropped to the ground and yelled, "Stop firing!" But it was pointless. Pretty soon there was shooting coming from every direction. The mammoth mosquito found the hole where the buckshot had ripped into the tent and squeezed through. It immediately fell onto Patterson. It wanted blood, and it was determined to have his. It stuck him with its long syringe mouth. I reached around in the dark for my knife, and once I found it, I crawled over and slashed at the beast repeatedly. It had the determination of an addict and continued to drain the dead man of his blood, even as I cut into it. It was hard to tell if and when the mosquito was dead. It continued to twitch and convulse as bugs do. So I kept slashing until it was unrecognizable and pieces of it were scattered around the tent. By the time I was sure it was dead, the gunfire had stopped. Not because the insects had fled, but because the rest of the men had exhausted our limited ammo. I knew I couldn't stay in the bloody tent while winged vampires continued to hunt us. That's when I thought of a possible solution. I dashed for the embers of the dying cook fire and tossed the last chunks of wood I'd gathered onto it. Then I dodged a swooping horror and ran to the forest edge and began hacking at the green, leafy branches of the nearest tree. "What the hell are you doing, Bentley?" Big Jim called as he emerged from his tent. "Making coffee?" "Smoke!" I yelled back frantically. "Mosquitoes hate smoke!" Tomlin took my meaning and turned back to his tent, gathering up plastic bottles, a synthetic tarp, and a handful of odds and ends to throw on the fire. Black smoke and nauseating odors rose from the pit, and I added my wet branches for even more miasma. Mulberry came into view. His clothes were stained red, just like mine. "Frederick is dead," he said in a flat tone, unable to process the experience of watching a man get sucked dry by something that should have been smaller than a dime. He took a flask out of his jacket and was going to put it to his lips when Jim snatched it from his hands and poured the home-brewed grain alcohol onto the fire. "It's for the cause, Professor." Mason joined us as we stoked the fire. We didn't ask what happened to Walker. We all knew. The lad and I altered between making runs for more wood and camp for supplies to burn, while Jim swung a hatchet at the occasional insect that wandered into the smoke. The professor was basically useless. He stood there, breathing in the fumes. It went on like that for hours. I thought for sure Mulberry was going to die, the way he languished while the rest of us struggled for life. But he was blessed with the luck of someone who has always been more of an observer than a participant in life. Sadly, Mason didn't fare so well. He was weighed down, dragging the trunk of a dead tree across the site, when one of the beasts spotted him and came down fast. It latched itself onto his chest and dug its proboscis into his shoulder. The youth was tenacious and tore the living syringe free. Unfortunately, another one perched on his back and punctured his neck. We watched helplessly, barely able to keep the creeps from taking our blood as well. By the time the sun began to rise, the mosquito attacks became less frequent. Our eyes and throats burned, and we were all caked in soot, blood, and whatever disgusting fluids came out of the creatures we killed. Eventually, the dive-bombing monsters stopped altogether. We quickly gathered supplies and started a feverish march back to town. We were beyond exhaustion, but determined to make it home before nightfall.